You're listening to Art Affairs, episode 97. Today I'll be talking to Ego. Alright, so my name is Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. Art Affairs is my attempt at shining a spotlight on the many wonderful people that make up this amazing art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, telling their stories. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairs.podcast.com, but the best way to stay plugged in is to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're really enjoying the show and want to help support what I'm doing here in an even bigger way, check out the Art Affairs Patreon. Not only does it give you an opportunity to help keep the show going, but there are several community-oriented benefits as well, like getting early access to episodes and suggesting questions for upcoming guests. You can find all the information about that at patreon.com/artaffairs. You can also connect with the show on Instagram at artaffairs.podcast. All right, so today's guest is artist Ego. Ego is a card-carrying member of the quote-unquote Dark Art Society. And while his work is on the darker side and could be described as macabre, it's also oddly charming and approachable. But Ego hasn't always had his personal art practice as his primary focus. He started his career working in graphic design. On the show, we talk about how he shifted from graphic design and tattooing to painting full-time, how the subjects in his work correlate to aspects of his own life, the new show he has coming up in November, and a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ego. Ego, welcome to the show, man. It's really good to have you on.
Hello. Glad to be on the show.
All right. Awesome. And so, like, if anybody's listening or has listened to the show before, they would know that I do a fair amount of research going into these chats, just so I come in well-informed. And with you, especially in the early part of your life, very little to know. I mean, there's very little to find about, like, where you grew up and what your, early years were like. So, that part of this conversation, I think I'm going to wing a little bit. So where did you grow up? I know you lived for a large part of your life in Seattle. Did you grow up somewhere in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, the answer that I give to people who I know I'm not going to have to interact with much is I'm from Seattle, because I've lived in Seattle since the early 90s. But the long answer is that I was born in Florida, but never spent much time there. I moved when I was an infant. And I was a military brat, so I moved all over the place. And I've lived in so many places. Like the kind of quick, brief rundown of the highlights, I guess, would be Florida, Virginia, New Jersey, Wisconsin, Georgia, Hawaii, Utah. Who am I leaving out? I know somebody's getting left out. Very, very brief time in Oklahoma. But yeah, the majority of my time has been in Seattle, Washington. It was the first place that I chose as home as a quote unquote grown up. I was pretty young, but I moved here on my own and chose this as my home. And I'm still here because I still like it.
What branch of the military was your family in?
So there was a lot of military in my family. Starting as far as I know, back to my grandfather who was in the Navy. I had an uncle who was in the Navy. My mom and my dad were both in the Air Force. My real dad died when I was 5. Later, my mom transferred to the Army, where she ultimately met my stepfather, who was also in the Army.
Okay. Wow. And so, like moving around as much as you did, was that difficult for you? I mean, just from like the respect of making friends and having like an established, friend group and all of those things, the social aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a tricky question because I don't know anything else. I don't have a basis for comparison. So like, yeah, a lot of times it felt bad, felt hard, like making friends and having to move. But I think just over years of doing that, I kind of got used to it, and that was just the way it was. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I suppose just over the course of moving around and making friends and moving around again, that just became
Yeah.
the norm. I think that's part of also why once I chose a home for myself, I've been here for so long.
Yeah.
Finally had a chance to put down some roots.
Right. So, with most of your family kind of being in some way involved in the service, did you have any people around you that were interested in the arts or doing any kind of creative practices?
There was no one in my family immediately that I can remember that was into any kind of visual art, really. There may have been some people who like doodled for funsies, for stress relief, whatever. And I had uh, an uncle who played guitar, but outside of that, I don't really remember anyone in my family being especially uh, creative or artsy in any way.
Is it something that they gave you much exposure to, though? Like, is it something that kind of fostered within you in the home?
No, not really. I think that was probably not a priority to anyone in my immediate family. I think my exposure to arts and culture was all basically just pop culture stuff, like movies and music and TV. I remember that my exposure to classical music was Bugs Bunny cartoons.
There was that. I mean, I do remember there was an element of that
Yeah.
in many of the shows. So like, then how did you become interested in making art? Like if it's not something, I mean, I feel like everybody has some element of pop culture exposure, yet
Yeah.
you kind of gravitated towards that, or at some point gravitated towards that. So like, how did you become interested in making art yourself?
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, I think, when you look back at my upbringing, that that's the life choice that I would have made. But from as far back as I can remember, like being a very young child, like I always knew that I wanted to be an artist. Uh, I've made this analogy before, and I'm sorry if anybody listening has heard it, but it's the one that I think kind of sums up where I'm at now the best. Like when I was little and all the other kids were being asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they would say, "Oh, a fireman or an astronaut or a policeman." Like I would always say an artist, even from back then. Um, and I don't remember any one particular catalyst that put me on that path, but it's the thing that I just always knew that I was going to do, and for better or worse, I've always followed that path, and I did it. Little kid ego, check us out, we did it.
Was that something that your parents like? I mean, they may not have like actively brought that into the house for you, but once you kind of did recognize that that's a path that you wanted to take, were they supportive of it? Did they encourage you?
I think when I was really little, like I think they may have been supportive. Just being an extra small child and drawing. I think most families kind of are expecting their kids to be creative and scribble and make pictures or whatever. But yeah, I don't feel like there was ever any push from the family to be like, oh, like, wow, you're showing some real skill here with your scribbles. Like, you should pursue that as a career and lifestyle. Yeah. So no, there was no real support. And then once I got older, like once I was a young teenager and, started drawing things that were a little bit more grim based on like some of the cultural stuff I was exposed to, like, some of the heavier music that I was listening to, like punk rock and heavy metal music. And I was a skateboarder. So, the skateboard graphics tended to be pretty aggressive and maybe a little grim looking. So once I started drawing that kind of stuff, I was especially not encouraged to pursue my art.
Yeah, I'd read that you, at least visually, got really into Kiss, like early on. Maybe not as much the music, but the visuals of Kiss was something that was you clung to, or at least was memorable. So, like, definitely like more on the darker side.
Yeah,
and like you said, skateboard culture, like that's certainly a big element. A lot of skulls on skateboards.
Too true. Yeah, and as for the Kiss thing, I think that's kind of funny. Like, I've talked about it before, how, just seeing posters of them when I was younger, like in the late 70s, just thinking, man, these guys are like the scariest looking thing. Like they must make like the scariest sounding music. It's got to sound like, the gates of hell being open and demons being unleashed. And then, like, I remember, hearing their music and just being flabbergasted that was the same people that I saw in the posters making that music, because, it sounded so like kind of upbeat and like, I want to rock and roll all night. And I'm like, wait a second, what?
Yeah,
no, that's not those guys.
Right?
Like, those guys sound like... So,
well, there was the guy with the cat whiskers, which is always kind of one of these things are not like the other sort of thing.
Yeah. Everyone else, was looking kind of scary, and he was like, I like cats. Right. I'm like, all right, man, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, do your thing. As an adult, you've had a fair amount of experience painting in the streets. Is that something you also took to at a young age, or did you have like much graffiti, folks or experiences around you?
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned like one of the places where I moved when I was younger was New Jersey, and that was kind of my first kind of home base. I lived in New Jersey off and on for close to a decade because my grandmother lived there. And when I was younger, my mom was in the military still. Like, she would send me to live with her mother because, for a lot of reasons, but mostly I think because she wasn't quite ready to be a mother yet. And, the traveling was, I'm sure, difficult enough for one person, but even more difficult, with a child. Being in New Jersey in the late 70s, early 80s, like that was certainly a cultural thing that was starting to happen. And I was definitely noticing that. There was specifically a PBS show that came on called Style Wars that was all about graffiti. And, just as a young kid seeing that, I was just like, wow, that is the coolest thing. Like, I want to be a part of that. And just being young and dumb and impressionable, sorry, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus here for being a bad role model, but like I was definitely drawn to that and tried to get my hands on some spray paint and, went behind the grocery store that was not too far from where I lived and, scribbled on the walls until I figured it out a little bit. And that was, probably 1985. And that bug, I guess, also never went away. And I saw spray paint as another creative medium that I wanted to master. And I don't know that I ever did, but I certainly got better with it. And I still use it as a medium sometimes, especially for doing larger work like murals. It's just so much faster. I can paint, probably 4 times faster with spray paint than I can with brushes, especially on large scale stuff. I don't do as much spray paint stuff these days, but if the occasion arises for a larger mural thing, like I'll definitely still break out the spray paint for that.
Yeah. Did you ever get into any kind of like trouble early on doing that stuff?
Not early on. It didn't catch up with me until much, much later. And it was kind of a funny set of circumstances how that happened also. Like there was a wall here in Seattle on a bar that always had like really nice graffiti productions on it, not just tags and quick like throw ups, but like actual like productions that people took time on and looked really nice. And it was understood that, we had permission from the bar owner, as long as, you're making it look nice, you can go ahead and do your thing there. So I was painting there one day, middle of the day, because, it was an allegedly permission spot, and the cops rolled up, and, I was right in the middle of painting, and they're like, "Hey." I turned around and I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Painting, duh." And they were like, and so I just turned around and kept painting, and they were like, "Hey." And I was like, "Yeah, what?" And they said, "Come here." I'm like, "Oh shit, here we go." So I go over, and they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, I'm painting." And they're like, you can't do that here. I'm like, "What are you talking about? Of course I can. Like, this is a legal wall." And they're like, "No, it's not. Who told you that?" And I was like, "That's common knowledge. Like, there have been paintings on this wall for years." And they're like, "Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean you can just do it." And I was like, "Oh man, here we go." And so I was like, "Well, can I finish up?" And they're like, "No, you can't finish up. Like, come here." And, read me my rights, put me in the car.
Oh man. So like, but the owner of the building told you could do it?
Well, not me specifically, but like I said, it was just one of those things that was kind of understood within the community. Like there had been so many productions on that wall that, it was just understood that like, this is a spot you can go. And I had done it many times before, and lots of other people that I knew had done it before. And so it just seemed like it was a safe spot to do that. But apparently,
wow,
that came to an end at some point. Like, I don't know if they got a different owner or if it was just a complete misunderstanding with the cops. I have no idea, but that happened. And that was the first time where like I'd really gotten in trouble for that. And it's funny that it happened at a spot like that, because there were plenty of other spots that I painted that were not understood to be a permission spot, and never got any trouble with that.
So did you end up going to art school?
No, I've never. Well, I mean, I've been to all kinds of art schools, but I've never taken any classes at them. I've had friends that have gone to art school, so I've gone to visit them or whatever. But no, I never actually took any classes at art school. Self-taught.
Like looking back, is there some aspect of what you've seen or perceived as a formal art education to include that you feel like you missed out on, that you wish you kind of had?
Well, when I was younger, like in my 20s, and had friends that were going to art school, like I definitely felt left out. Like I felt like I was missing out on something. Like it seemed like they were like doing like this cool thing, and art school seemed like a really cool way to go to college. And, when I was younger, knowing that I was always going to be an artist, I assumed that if I ever went to art school or college at all, it was going to be art school. And that, never came to pass for a lot of reasons. but like the FOMO of seeing people that I knew at art school, kind of made me think, man, I wish I could do that. But then once I got to see a little bit of what they were, quote unquote, learning, it kind of made me start questioning the whole art school thing. And I was like, maybe I'm not really missing out too much on this. And I thought to myself, like, okay, it seems to me like the big things, like the important points of art school are you're surrounded by other people who are, pursuing a similar interest. You have access to reference materials, and you have time that's put aside specifically to make art every day. So I thought, okay, well, those are the main components that seem like the important things of art school. So if I can do that without having to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars,
right,
like maybe that's the way to go. So I tried to do that. Like I gradually invested in an art library. I would just get art books whenever I could, mostly secondhand, because I'm poor and always have been poor, so I couldn't really afford to buy expensive things. So I would just, every once in a while get a new art book whenever I could and study that and, do my best to emulate some of the styles and techniques that I saw, without having any explanation of how that stuff happened. Like I'm just seeing the final product and trying to figure out, like how do I make mine look like that? So just trial and error. And then tried to do my best to like set time aside so that I could spend as much time practicing as possible, but, still being a poor 20-something, like I had to work to pay the bills, but, I would still make it a priority. And then most of the friends that I had were artists in some respect. So I had that community like you would have at art school. And
Sure.
Some of those people actually went to art school. So that was maybe a bonus too. I don't know if I got some trickle down art school from them. But yeah, like I basically had like my personal version of art school. Like I had reference materials now. I was setting time aside specifically to make art. I was surrounded by other people who were interested in what I was interested in and who were also creating art. So like, I feel like I got all the benefits of art school without the huge debt of art school, which a lot of those friends are still struggling with decades later.
Yeah. No, that's really cool that you kind of put that thought into like, how can I recreate the, the positive aspects of this without having to go underwater with debt.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that you were doing other kinds of work to pay the bills. I know you were a graphic designer early on. Is that the kind of work that you were doing at that time?
Well, knowing that I would always be an artist at some point, I would try to, do any kind of art related work that I could find. So mostly I would just work, whatever crappy job I could get. And there were all kinds of those, like so many that I can't remember most of them. But, at one point, like I worked at a Baskin Robbins ice cream joint and, other not art related jobs, but whenever possible would try to like, get a gig doing like a t-shirt design for, a friend's band or, some small time clothing companies. And I got a couple of those types of jobs early on doing t-shirt designs for companies and thought, okay, well, it looks like this is going to be the direction I'm going to go in art. Like I'm going to be like an illustrator or like graphic designer. But the more of those kind of jobs that I did And the more professional those jobs got, the more that I started to run into, it wasn't just like, some guy who had a company that was like, hey, will you draw this cool picture for my company's t-shirt or this logo? It then becomes, okay, well, now I'm dealing with the art director from some bigger company. And that art director has people who he reports to. And so now it's not just, hey, will you draw this cool thing? It's like, okay, so we want this cool thing, but 5 other people have to like it also. And, good luck getting 5 grown-ass people to agree on anything, but especially art stuff. And the worst part about that was, I would get really tight deadlines. Like they would need really quick turnaround times for like no money. And, being young and hungry, I was like, yeah, okay, cool. Like it's Monday. You need this by Wednesday night for $150. Cool. You got it. And so, I would meet with this art director and they would, tell me like, yeah, I need an image of a blue lady in front of a green lake with purple mountains in the background and need it by Wednesday for $150. I'd be like, all right, blue lady, green lake, purple mountains. Got it. And, they would always say stuff like, we love your work. So just, do whatever you want to do, like have fun with it. And I would be like, all right, cool. Like, got it. Blue lady, green lake, purple mountains by Wednesday. And then I would immediately go home and start working on this thing and bust my ass to get it done in time. And, be sweating the whole time thinking, man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull this off and don't know if it's going to look cool. But, I would somehow magically always get it done. And I would be super proud of it when I was finished. Like, damn, I can't believe I did this so fast and it actually looks decent. And, proudly meet with the art director again and be like, there you go. What do you think? Thinking they'd be like, oh man, this is the best thing I've ever seen. But then inevitably they'd be like, oh, it looks great. But after talking with some of the other people on the team, we actually decided what we want is a red wolf in a blue forest. I'm like,
and you got 2 more days to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, okay, cool. I guess I'll go get to work on that now. And it was just years of that kind of interaction that made me think there's got to be something else. And like I guess I always knew that fine art was a career, it was a thing, but like it just wasn't really in like my sphere of existence. Like I didn't really know a lot of people early on who did that. And later on, I kind of met some people who did and was like, like this fine art thing kind of seems like the way to go. Like you pretty much just get to paint whatever you want.
Right.
And it hangs in a gallery and someone sees it and they like it and they buy it. And there's no like middleman telling you what you have to do. And I was like, yeah, that's where I'm going. So I focused my attention on that. And, from there, just tried to get my foot in with my fine art stuff. And like, I was still figuring out the medium that I was going to use. So early on, I was using everything, markers and soft pastels and sometimes acrylic paint, sometimes, spray paint, just like whatever I could use to try to make my images look as refined as the ones that I saw in, the art books that I had, or, at the time, like Juxtapose magazine was just kind of coming up and I was starting to see that stuff and be like, oh man, like this is where I want to be. And would see, like the ads in the magazine for the art shows that were coming up and see like, the list of artists and be like, oh, I got to find out, who all these people are, and would study like all these artists. And at the time, this was early 90s ish. So yeah, there was the internet, but it wasn't what it is now.
Right.
Not everyone had quick access to it, and it didn't contain as much information, and that information wasn't as easy to access. So, a lot of this stuff I'm still, trying to find books. So I would see an artist's name and I would say, oh, is there any book that they have out or that they're a part of? And oftentimes there wasn't. It was more or less just what I would see in Juxtapose, but that was enough. Like, they would have a feature and I'd be like, all right, well, I can see this person's stuff. It's really cool. Like, how do I make my stuff look more refined like that using the materials that I have? And then after a while of refining materials, like I started using acrylic paint because I realized with that I could kind of get some of those effects a little bit more easily. I could cover areas like more effectively and opaquely. I don't know if opaquely is a word, but I said it, so there it is. And kind of started refining my skills with acrylic paint. And by the time I was pretty deep into figuring that out, like, I started to realize when I was looking at a lot of these images, like, I would pay attention to all the little details and was starting to notice, the size and medium that these other artists were using. I was like, wait a second, like, the stuff I'm doing is much smaller than the stuff they're doing. And the medium is very different. Like, almost every single one of these that I'm looking at says oil paint. And I'm like, maybe I need to figure out this oil paint thing. But I was already so invested in learning how to make my stuff look like that stuff with acrylic paint that I was like, well, like, I already can kind of do this with the techniques that I've figured out. So I don't know if I really need to learn this, but it seems like the only paintings that are in this world are oil paintings. So I figured, well, shit, I should probably figure it out at some point. And I did dabble a bit with oil paint, but found that I wasn't happy with the drying time of oil paint. Like, it just took too long. Like, I would be able to get, maybe one layer of paint down, and then if I tried to put anything else on, it would just move around and it wasn't staying where I wanted it to stay, and I would get frustrated. And like, I wasn't especially fast painting, and so to be able to finish a painting with oil and have it dry in time to hang it for a show, like, I didn't have that kind of time. And that's a luxury that acrylic offered that oil didn't. I mean, for me, there were just like a lot of pros for acrylic paint that just led me to stick with it and try to just improve my technique with that. And I feel like I ultimately got there. And even though I did some, experiments with oil paint and did a couple paintings that looked decent, like, at the end of the day, I would look at those oil paintings compared to my acrylic paintings, and I didn't see enough of a difference to think, okay, well, I have to switch everything over to oil paint now because it looks so much better. Like, I didn't think that at all. Like, I felt like my acrylic paintings looked better than the oil paintings. Not that they were bad. Like, the oil paintings looked fine, but thinking of the headaches that went into producing them compared to the acrylic paintings, I was like, no contest. I'm just going to stick with this. And like, I also started to notice that there were a handful of fine artists that I respected who were also using acrylic. And I was surprised by that in a very good way. Like, I was like, wait, they're kind of doing the same thing I'm doing. Like, their stuff looks like the other stuff. It looks like oil paint, but they're also using acrylic. I was like, okay. I felt a little vindicated at that point. I was like, all right, well, so no, it's not everybody is using oil paint and you're not going to be taken seriously if you don't. Because that was my impression. I was like, well, if you're going to be in this fine art world, you got to use the fine art materials and, whatever. And it took years to realize that no, that's not the case. Like, you're good or you're not good.
I mean, it's all just the tools that you use to make a thing, and however you get to that end, it's more about the end than it is how you got there.
That's how I feel, also.
As you were developing some of these things in your practice, learning how to create things in a way that would visualize the style that you wanted to create, and learning the acrylic process and how to make all of these things while you were also doing a day job in graphic design and then later tattooing. Was it difficult to balance those things so that you did have enough time to make those kinds of learnings and create this personal practice of yours?
I think I was learning that stuff at kind of the perfect time to be learning that stuff, because I was in my, late teens, early 20s, more early 20s. And I don't know about you, but for me and most of the people in our early 20s at the time, like, time was irrelevant. Like, we would make time to do all the things somehow, magically, and sleep was somehow less necessary. So yeah, I would absolutely make time to do it and prioritize it, even though it seemed like at the time I was doing a ton of other things and, ruckusing like an early 20s person does, but still prioritizing, like figuring out how to make the art look better. I think it helped that I had a lot of friends that were also artists. And so a lot of my social interactions would be, hanging out with other artists and making art. So I think it worked out really well that I was learning that stuff when I was learning that stuff. Even though at the time I thought, well, I'm already getting into this kind of late. Like, I should have already been a better painter by now. My career's never gonna take off until I'm 80 at this point. But luckily that didn't prove to be the case. So yeah, like I made time no matter what, because it was a priority. It was a thing that I always wanted to do, regardless of any of the other interests that I was pursuing at the time. And you mentioned tattooing, like, tattooing was just another one of those jobs where I saw an opportunity to work in the field of art. It wasn't my first choice. I was kind of peer pressured into it.
Really?
Just because I was an artist. I think that's not uncommon. Like, if there are peer groups where there are some folks that are tattooed and they see that, one of their friends has some ability in art, they're like, oh, this guy is going to be the tattooer. And so I think people kind of assumed that of me early on too. Like, I would hear it all the time. They'd be like, oh man, your art is really good. You should be a tattooer. And I was like, that's not really like the path that I've chosen for myself. Like, I don't think so, but thank you for saying that my art's good. And of course, at the time, my art was crap, but
it's all relative.
Best, yeah, exactly. Like the best kid that can draw in your, fifth grade class is the artist, and that's kind of where I was at. Like, I had some ability. It was rough still, but people would be like, oh, you can draw, you should be a tattooer. And I just heard that for years and years and years and put it off and put it behind me. And I had, friends who, as we were all getting older, were getting more tattoos. And so I would, go along with them while they were getting tattooed. And, sometimes even the tattooers would, notice my art stuff and be like, oh man, you're pretty good. Have you ever thought about being a tattooer? And I'm like, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that, I'd be rich. But I think it was just hearing that so often, I eventually kind of caved. Like, I got to a point where I got a little bit of money from a settlement from a motorcycle accident that I was in. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to buy some tattoo equipment. And I did, and I kind of did it like under the radar. Like I didn't tell a lot of people that I was doing it. It was just a thing that I kind of wanted to see if I could do, like after hearing, for years, oh, you should do this. You should do this. I was like, well, I'm going to just see if I can do this. And, I'm sure, well, 100% sure in hindsight that just buying some equipment without knowing shit about shit and just attempting to tattoo is probably not the best way to go about it. But again, I was kind of doing it under the radar and didn't want people to know that I was doing it. It was something that I just kind of wanted to see if I could do. And so like I was just tattooing punk rockers and like people that I knew, just to get my chops and figure it out. And, I felt kind of bad, just starting out, not knowing shit about shit, tattooing people. But, with a lot of these punk rockers, they would just be like, yeah, whatever, man, I don't care. It's free. I'm like, all right. This is like the third one I've ever done. They're like, that's cool. Free. Yep. All right. And so,
well, I mean, how else do you learn that sort of thing?
Yeah,
you have to kind of learn in doing, and those first ones are going to be rough.
Yeah, but the best and like established way to do that, which I didn't find out until later, is that you find an apprenticeship.
Oh, okay.
So you find a mentor that is willing to like save you some of the heartache and headache of the learning curve. Like, you find someone who already knows what the hell they're doing and is willing to take you on and bring you into this shadowy, mysterious world. But I didn't know that at the time and found that out a little bit later and realized that had I not been trying to be so undercover about it and just like said, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it the right way. I'm going to, find someone to apprentice under. It would have saved me probably 3 years of trial and error. I would have been 3 years further ahead in, my skills. It just took longer because I didn't know much aside from like the few times I had been to tattoo shops with other people while they were getting tattooed. And I wasn't really paying super close attention to what the tattooers were doing at the time because I didn't think that was going to be something that I was going to do. So yeah, I just kind of bumbled my way through until I figured it out a little bit. And then it just turned out that I'm super stubborn and wasn't going to allow this medium to defeat me. Because it's super hard. I think people don't understand that. Like, and part of what leads me to believe that I think people don't understand how difficult it is the whole thing of the years of people saying, "Oh, you draw good. You should be a tattooer."
Right.
The two are barely relatable. Like being able to draw and being able to tattoo are two completely different things. Like the skill of tattooing is unlike any other art medium that I've ever encountered. Like there are hardly any similarities to any other medium. It's its own beast for sure. And it's very, very difficult to master, let alone get even decent at. But I ended up going from, a curiosity sparked by peer pressure to a 25-year career as a tattooer.
I was going to say, like, for something that started out as peer pressure, you ended up being there for 25 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing about that was, like I said, it was a career in art, kind of. I mean, not kind of. It absolutely was. It was a career in art. It wasn't the kind of career in art that I was expecting. But I was doing art for a living every day. And even though it wasn't what I expected or necessarily wanted, I got so many valuable skills from tattooing. The art influenced the tattooing, and the tattooing influenced the art. The more I did it, and the more like I had to create images that I wasn't necessarily fond of, the more I just learned how to draw everything. Wow. Things I would have never chosen to draw, I would have to draw for clients. And so like after 25 years of doing that, like I just learned so much more about art than I ever thought I would. And like, you know, various different subjects that I never thought I would. And you would have to, you wouldn't have to, like you could be a shit artist and just throw something together. But if you want to be half decent, like you do your research on the thing that you're drawing. Like if it was a thing that I wasn't familiar with, I would have to research it. Like I'm sure other artists and tattooers can probably relate to this, but like the first time you have to draw a rose or, you know, water, like it's daunting. Like you can see other examples of it that people have done, but when you don't understand like the patterns of it, or like I don't know, like there's just like a certain like way that these things are constructed. And if you don't understand it, looking at it, it looks crazy. Like it looks unintelligible. You're like, how did they make this look this way? I don't understand. But then after you've done it a few times, you're like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to get it now. I see how they're constructed. I see how the petals from the rose fall a certain way. And you start, you know, looking at roses in nature. You find photos of roses. Like you start studying this thing so that you know how to do it correctly. And so that happened with all kinds of imagery. Like I learned how to do things correctly by just studying so hard on like this thing that I had to draw for a tattoo. So I owe a lot to tattooing for sure. Like it got me so many more skills than I expected to get. But the funny part about the whole 25 years thing is that from the very beginning, I always thought it was just going to be like a temporary thing until my art career took off. And it totally was. But the temporary nature ended up being 25 years. That's right. How long it took until my fine art career actually got me to a point where I was making enough money to scrape by and didn't have to tattoo anymore. And since then, I'm going to say a thing that I think maybe a lot of up and coming fine artists might need to hear, because I certainly think I would have liked to have heard this early on. Like I saw my idols, my, you know, art idols in the art magazines and thought, you know, like they're doing these shows all over the world and like everybody knows who they are. Like they've made it, man. Like that's where I want to be. Like I want to be to a point where, you know, I'm famous and I'm making money doing art. And I realized after years and years and years of doing that and like coming up through the ranks of the art world and starting to get to do shows with some of these people who I idolized, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm in a show with so-and-so. Like I never thought like I would get a chance to be in this gallery with this artist, you know, showing in Germany. Like this is crazy. But wait a second, I'm still poor, like really poor. Like how can this be? Like I thought once I got to this point, like showing with these artists, you know, in these galleries, you know, once I got to like this caliber, like I made it, right? No, man. Like the more I got to know these people, the more I realized they're in the same boat. Like there are very few fine artists, at least at this level, in this like genre. When I say genre, I'm talking about specifically for me, like the more macabre stuff, which is a little less mainstream. But even still, like, I guess the closest term that was coined years ago is like the lowbrow stuff. It's not like the high end, like, bougie, like abstract expressionist stuff that you see in galleries that sells for, $40,000 for, some paint splattered on a canvas. No offense if that's what you do. Maybe a little offense, but anyway, yeah. So like doing the stuff that I do and seeing my peers that do the stuff that I do, like it's not what I expected. Like I really thought that you get to a certain point where you're in, a prestigious circle of artists showing at prestigious galleries around the world, that you got it, man. You did it. You made it. You're doing the thing. You're living your dream. Nah, that's not the case. Like you're always struggling. There are a very small handful of artists that work in this field, like in anything even remotely close to this genre, that are like actually making enough money to not really have to sweat it. Like the biggest example that I can think of, and I'm sure he has his issues too, like everybody does, but like Mark Ryden is the only one who I can think of who's like kind of even remotely working in this genre, who I think is doing financially very well. But everyone else that I know is struggling and is working, to try to pay the bills every month. And I'm in that same boat. Like, so if you see my stuff, if you're younger me and you're like, oh man, like this guy is showing in all these cool galleries with all these other cool artists, like, yes, I am. And that is cool. And I'm grateful. And it's feels great, but I have not made it, air quotes. Like no one, I think a very, very small percentage of artists make it the way you think that they've made it. I'm still struggling. I'm still super poor. I live painting to painting. Like if I don't paint, I don't eat. And I'm not unhappy about that. Like I'm poor, but I'm poor on my own terms. And kind of going back to the tattooing thing, like whenever my friends or people that I know, or even people I don't know, hear me complain about being poor, they say, well, why don't you just go back to tattooing? And the issue there is that I did it for 25 years and got to the point where it just felt bad. Like I won't be too melodramatic, but like it just got to a point where it got painful to do for me, like emotionally. Saying the same shit every single day for 25 years, telling the same stupid jokes every day for 25 years. And, there were just a lot of things that I wouldn't deal with anymore. And there was no amount of financial stability that was going to keep me in it. Like I would rather be poor and happy doing the work that I'm doing rather than being, somewhat financially stable, but like hating my life.
Right. You mentioned earlier that while you were tattooing, one of the valuable skills that you learned was being able to draw anything, because people would come to you and ask for things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily draw if it was your choice of what you were drawing. So like during that period, and also during the period of graphic design where you're executing other people's ideas, was it difficult for you to establish your own creative voice and identify your style while doing all this work for other people? Kind of figuring out what you wanted to say with your work rather than always servicing other people's ideas.
That's a great question. And it's a thing that I think about a lot whenever I hear people talking about style and developing style, and like young artists, talk a lot about, finding their style. I don't think I'm alone when I say that style is something that develops on its own. Like, it is the sum of all of the input of information that you're getting over the course of your career. I don't think that it's a good idea to focus too much on like creating or developing a specific style. I think that's a thing that's just going to evolve over time, whether you like it or not. My style is exactly what I just described. It is the sum of all the input that I've had over the years that just goes through my specific filter and comes out the way it comes out, just based on what I ultimately think aesthetically pleases me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, like, at what point, you said it took 25 years to develop your personal practice enough to where you could really have that be the thing. At what point did you just start making some of those relationships with galleries and start having shows?
While, I say it took 25 years, it wasn't like in that 25th year, like boom, right. Everything just happened. It was every year of those 25 years, things were progressing, starting out, trying to get your foot in the door, showing art, like you show wherever anyone will allow you to show, you show at cafes, you show at bars, you show wherever there's an opportunity, and opportunities lead to opportunities. Like, that's the thing that it's also kind of important to stress to younger upcoming artists. Like, you're not likely going to be discovered. Like, you're not going to have some rinky-dink show at a cafe and like, some art world elite is going to come in there and be like, oh, I've discovered this new brilliant artist and now their career is going to take off and they're going to get their mansion and helicopter with a hot tub in it with tigers. No, that is not how it works. Like, you show at that cafe, and then maybe if you're lucky, some gallerist sees it at the cafe and contacts you and is like, hey, I have this small gallery. It's not much, but we would love to show your work there. And you say, oh, well, that's great. Thanks a lot. Now I'm not showing in cafes anymore. Now I'm showing in a small gallery. And then you show at that small gallery. And if you're lucky, someone else sees that and is like, hey, like, I have this other gallery that's somewhere else. Like, would you like to show here? And, in the early days, you say, yes, I do. I want to show everywhere I can possibly show. And you do that. Like, you shouldn't anyway. You shouldn't be picky about like where you're showing when you're first starting out. Like, anywhere you can get your work in front of eyes, do it. That's my opinion. I feel like there is maybe a wave of artists coming up who feel like, they need to show in a prestigious gallery or they're not going to show their work. Well, I mean, good luck with all that. Like, you kind of have to start somewhere. And I don't think most artists' work is good enough to be able to just come right out of the box and be in a prestigious gallery. There are, of course, exceptions to everything that I'm saying, but I would say, in my experience, that that's just not how it works. You have to kind of take the steps. You show wherever you can show. You hope that the work is good enough to catch the attention of someone who can, take you to a next level, get you in a better gallery that's going to get more eyes on it. That'll maybe get you slightly better prices, etc. And I guess now also a thing that was not at all a thing when I was coming up is social media, and that changed everything. Like, that's a way to get your work in front of eyes that chances are pretty good would have never otherwise seen your work. I feel like that changed everything.
I mean, like, thinking about the the mid 90s discussion you had earlier where you couldn't find anything and you relied on magazines and books. Yeah. Now it's like the complete opposite where everything is available all the time.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe too much.
Right. Exactly. I guess since those early shows that you talked about where you're just trying to get your work in front of as many eyes as possible to today, you've since made pretty good relationship with, Copro Gallery, for instance, which is where your last solo show was. Mm-hmm. I guess, how did you make that first connection with Gary and the folks at Copro?
It was just like I was discussing earlier, it was all just a progression. I did some shows, I want to say in the early 2000s in California that were curated through Creep Machine. There are some folks that may be familiar with that and some that aren't, but Creep Machine was an earlier social media, I guess, curator. Josh, who runs that, would show other artists' work on his Instagram account. And it was, more or less seemed to be dedicated to, dark art and stuff that was a little more like off the beaten path. And so I was lucky to catch his attention and be invited to a show that he curated. And that show also had, some artists that were working in a similar field that were a little further along in their careers, that already had gotten a little attention. Like Chet Zar was already kind of coming up at that point, and I was happy to be involved in a show that had other artists who I thought were already, a little more advanced in the field. So I felt like, oh man, like this is a real honor to be a part of this. And so, you start getting into these shows with better artists, and then you develop relationships with the artists and the curators. And that opens you up to other opportunities. And so I want to say, having some of those earlier shows caught the attention of some other artists and curators and gallerists. And I think you then start to get invitations based on like these connections. So like I do this as well. Like if I'm being asked to be a part of a show, like a group show, like if there's somebody who I know who I think would be a good fit for the theme of the group show, or just like would be a good member of that group in general, like I'll suggest it to the curator or the gallerist. I'll be like, hey, like this is a super cool show. Thanks for inviting me. Who would also be good for this show? So-and-so. And, drop their name and hope that, that works out. I've even had a few opportunities to curate shows myself. I've developed good enough relationships with galleries where they're like, hey, would you be interested in curating a show in October? I'd say, yeah, sure. That sounds great. And put together a list of folks who I like, who think would, fit well. So that happened enough times that eventually I weaseled my way into the first Dark Art Society show at Copro. And I think Chet Zar had a pretty heavy hand in that. I think he curated the whole thing himself. I'm not 100% sure, but basically I just kind of threw a Hail Mary pass and was like, hey, Chet, like I reached out to him by like email or social media and was like, I know like you've already got this show put together, but is there any chance like I could maybe get a piece in that show? And he was like, yeah, if you can get it here by, next week. And I was like, oh, I'll do it. And, managed to weasel my way into that show. And that was how my relationship with Copro happened, because that show was at Copro Gallery. Gary kind of followed up with me after that show and was like, "Hey, I liked your piece. We'd be interested in working with you again in the future." And I was like, "Oh man, this is great. Like, this is what you hope for." But what you don't hope for is that shit is right before COVID kicks in.
Oh man.
So that kind of got sidetracked for a few years. But like, I still had that in the back of my head. Like, Gary from Copro said he liked your stuff and wanted to work with you again. Don't sleep on that potential connection. And, as the COVID thing was starting to, be a little more under control and things were starting to open up again, like I reached back out to Gary and was like, "Hey, I don't know if you remember me, but like you mentioned at some point that you were interested in maybe working with me again, and I'm definitely interested in working with you. Is there, any opportunity coming up that might work out?" And that got us talking, and as they say, the rest is history. And now I've, shown with them several times, and it's my favorite gallery to show with. I feel like it's more or less like the gallery in the United States that does like the kind of stuff that I do and showcases that work and those artists. And so I'm really happy to be associated with them.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's how that happened.
And I feel like, I guess earlier you mentioned the Dark Arts label, and I've talked to a handful of artists that we've had on that kind of fit into that category. I guess, how do you feel about labels, and how do you relate to that dark art label for your own work?
I hear a lot of people complain about labels and being labeled and, kind of being put into a box. And I understand that. Like, if that's not your thing, if you would rather not have your work associated with a certain movement, like, I 100% understand that. But I feel like regardless of what your intentions are, your work is going to fit in with other work in some way, and people are going to make a connection to that and are going to say, "Oh, this work is similar to that work. So you're obviously like those people that make work that's that way." And I'm not mad at that. Like, yeah, like I can identify that, yes, my work is darker in theme and tone than other work that I see. And I'm perfectly happy to be associated with other artists that create, quality work that looks that way. So I embrace that label. Like, I think it's great. Like, I'm proud member of the Dark Art Society.
Oh, yeah.
And happy that it got to a point where there was enough of that art happening that it got its own subgenre. Like, I'm super happy that there are enough of us making that kind of work that, we have a label. I think that's super.
That's awesome. And so, like, your style in particular, good segue. It seems to be more like macabre portraits, I guess, is the simple, like, two-word description. But dark, but like oddly charming and like approachable, which I think is an interesting element also. Do these portraits, I guess, the subjects of your paintings, do they correlate to like real people in your life, or what is the relationship between your work and like your life?
I see. The hard-hitting journalism kicks in. That is a good question. Well, I don't consciously create these characters based on people that I know. That's not to say that subconsciously there is a basis. I would say more often than not, they're kind of more autobiographical. Yeah, I don't know. Like, there are parts of people that I know, I guess, personalities of people I know, but I think mostly it's not based on any specific people, but more just on a type of person who's not
like an archetype.
Yeah, an archetype, or I guess like in the simplest terms, like weird loners and outcasts. People, or I guess in this case, like creatures, entities who seem they maybe don't fit in, even though like they're well intentioned. You mentioned like macabre, but kind of charming, and I guess in a lot of ways like that's a really good description. Like yeah, my subject matter is often dark, and I do a lot of skulls and seemingly creepy stuff, but like it's not like gory and like over the top like evil. It's spooky, but like like you said, like kind of charming in a way. Like yeah, like this entity only has one eye, and like they're maybe kind of creepy looking, and it looks like their face is made of stone and cracking, but like they're not. When you look at it, you don't think, oh, like they're gonna get me.
Yeah, it's not like a jump scare kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's still like approachable. Like
yeah, you're like, oh man, like they're kind of scary, but kind of sad. Like, what's their story? Like, why are they so sad? Oh, maybe because they look that way and people are scared of them. I don't know. So yeah, I feel like maybe just the whole like vibe of my work in general is just kind of the misunderstood outcast.
I wonder, and not to be like all therapist in this conversation, but I wonder if that ties, just thinking back about, you had said earlier when I asked, like, was it difficult moving around a lot, and like what impact that might have had, and you were like, well, I don't know any other thing. Like, that's just what I know. I kind of wonder now if that goes back to that, like subconsciously back to that experience, and this is just your way of expressing those feelings of being kind of on the outside.
Yeah, that's a really keen observation. Yeah, I had not put a lot of thought into the meanings behind a lot of my work for years. Like I paint the things that I paint, and I just am drawn to like these certain aesthetics, and like these characters just come out the way they come out. And I always had it in my head that there wasn't really like much more to it than like, this is just what I like to paint. But the more like people try to attach some kind of meaning to the paintings, the more it made me think about, what the meaning was. And for a lot of years I thought, well, shit, I feel kind of weird that, these other artists seem to have so much meaning attached to their work, and like they understand like really like what their paintings are trying to say. And I'm like, wow, I don't really feel like I have that so much. But the more I've thought about it, like what you've just said about like my upbringing and like the way I am, definitely is, the meaning. Like that's what seeps into all my paintings that I didn't realize early on, like couldn't put my finger on. But yeah, it's definitely, my subconscious feelings of being a misunderstood outcast.
Yeah.
And I suppose you were succinct, and we could have just left it at that.
No, but it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the work ultimately being the sum total of all of your experiences, and that kind of accumulated and manifested into what you're making today.
Yeah, 100%.
When you're starting to work on like a new body of work, or maybe it's for a piece for a group show, how do you like approach ideation? How do you kind of arrive at ideas for new pieces? Do you have like an intentional brainstorming session where you're trying to figure stuff out, or do you just have a daily sketch routine and then you pick the best of those? Like, what's your approach to ideation?
Oh, Michael, such good timing on this question. I have a featured show coming up in November on the East Coast, and I am smack dab in the middle of that very thing that you're talking about. Like, what the fuck am I going to paint for this thing?
Nice.
After, so many years doing this, a lot of the early work, it seemed easy for me to come up with subject matter. Like I felt like I had a really good imagination, and like a lot of the stuff I was doing, I felt like, oh man, like that's a good idea. Like I'm clever, pat on the back, attaboy. But the more years I've done it, the more I'm like, oh man, I feel like I've like exhausted every good, clever, creative, imaginative idea that I've ever had. And there have been times where I'm like, okay, well, what I could potentially do is go back to some of my early work where I thought the ideas were really good, but maybe I wasn't quite as skilled yet. So I couldn't necessarily like portray that image as well as I could now with the skills that I've developed over the years. So what if I go back to some of these old ideas and try to tighten those up and, make them look more the way I imagined they should look at the time, but didn't have the skill. So I've done that a few times, and I've been pretty happy with the results. But even that, there's a limited well before I catch up to,
right,
more recent work. And I'm like, okay, well, I've redone all the stuff that I feel like I needed to revisit. What now? I got to come up with new ideas again. And it's tricky. The thing that I've been doing lately is a thing that, I've heard some artists kind of look down on, and like even one of the artists who I don't know if I would say idolize, but definitely respect, said that he never really used any like reference or any other like inspiration from other artists. And man, good for him, and bless his brain for being able to do that. But like I 100% look to other artists for inspiration. Not to the point where, I'm just going to rip off someone else's idea. Like I have a great disdain for people who do that, who just take someone else's hard work and, build a career off of it. But like, yeah, I 100% rip off other artists, but the difference is I'm not ripping off any one artist. I'm ripping off 300 artists that, I've accumulated imagery from over the years and putting it through my filter. So like I could maybe point out some references in a painting where I say, oh, this was inspired by this. And you might be able to look at it and go, I do not see that at all. Well, that's because that has also gone through, the filter of every other thing that inspired that, and, other outside sources that are not, other artists. Like some of the weirdest inspiration that I've had is like I'll see like a spot. Like I live in a city. I live in Seattle, and so there's a fair amount of graffiti and blight, whatever. I'm not necessarily saying that all graffiti is blight, but there's both, and sometimes they overlap. But with a heightened amount of graffiti, there's also an equally heightened amount of graffiti being painted over. And so there are times where I'll be, just walking around the city and see where, some graffiti had gotten, buffed over with gray paint, and maybe another time, and there's like 3 or 4 layers of like gray paint that's buffing over graffiti, but has now created its own interesting shapes. And I'll look at those shapes sometimes and be like, actually, I kind of see, this figure in that shape that's left over from, the graffiti being buffed over. So like that's, probably not what most people would think that's where my inspiration came from. But yeah, like that's one of the really unusual places that I'll get inspiration, or, nature. There's a lot of nature surrounding this city. It's a pretty unique, good-sized metropolitan city in that it is located right on the Puget Sound, which is the Pacific Ocean. Right across the sound from where I live, you can take a ferry to a temperate rainforest. You can then go from that rainforest further out to the coast, where there are crazy like rock formations out in the ocean with like trees growing on them, with like natural arches that have been cut through them by the ocean. And it looks like some kind of, sci-fi landscape. It's like that can be super inspiring. Like the dark forests are super inspiring. Just like the hazy, like grayness of the Pacific Northwest. Like it sounds gloomy, and like I think it makes a lot of people sad and uncomfortable, but it's inspiring to me. Like I love that gloom and that haze. That definitely gets into my work. But there's every climate you can imagine around Seattle. I was saying there's the ocean, there's the rainforest. On the other side of the mountains, which that's another thing, we have mountains surrounding us. There's a lot of mountains. Like we're literally in a giant valley surrounded by mountains. And if you go over those mountains east, there are deserts. So like you get all these crazy climates. There's deserts, there's lush rainforests, there's mountains, there's the ocean. Like there aren't a lot of places on Earth that have all of those climates within, a 2-hour drive. So I'm lucky to have all that stuff, and all of that definitely at some point works its way into my paintings. Even if it's not always evident, sometimes it is. Like sometimes it's, blatantly like the ocean is the background, or like the mountains, or like, mossy forests. Like sometimes it's very obvious. It's like those exact things, but other times it's less obvious, and it'll just go into like the mood of the thing. Like it'll just be like a little gray and hazy, like whatever the image is, like it's just gray and hazy. And that's just part of the aesthetic that sinks in from the environment that I live in.
Once you do have like a solid idea for a piece that you want to move forward with, how do you develop the composition further? Do you do like pencil ink drawings and then do painting, or do you just jump right into the painting?
It varies. I also teach a little bit, and when I'm teaching, like I'll try to offer all of the various ways that I begin a painting as an option for the people taking the classes. And those generally tend to be doing a drawing on paper first, and then transferring that onto the panel, and then painting it, doing a drawing directly on the panel with pencil, and then sealing the pencil and then painting over it, going straight onto the primed panel with paint and doing a sketch with paint, and then evolving that, refining it. Those are the main methods that I use for like the preliminary stages. Sometimes the idea will require me to do a more involved drawing, but often it's better for me to just get like the general shapes down. And if it's a thing, especially if it's a symmetrical image, it's important that I get the dimensions a little bit refined before I put it onto the panel, just so that it can be, measured precisely so that it actually looks symmetrical. So that's the kind of image that I wouldn't typically just, start painting before I put anything down. Like I would measure that out and make sure that the symmetry is obvious. But if it's not a symmetrical image, like any of those other methods are definitely a way that I work. It's pretty rare that I'll just start putting paint down, but it's happened enough times that some of my favorite paintings have started that way.
Wow.
Without much of a forethought, like just, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to start painting and see what happens. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it doesn't. Like it's probably 50-50. There'll be times I get started that way and think, oh yeah, this is really starting to turn into something. And then the more I refine it, the more I'm like, actually, I really hate this and I'm going to paint over it. So yeah, like sometimes I'll have an idea that's so, I don't know, I guess specific that I have to do like a more refined drawing before I start it. But I think that's more and more rare the further I get into my practice. I feel like I really, more than anything, just need like a really basic idea and a shape. And then I do all the refinement with the paint. Like sometimes it's so rudimentary that it's just like an oval with 2 circles for the face. But then by the time it's done, there's so much like tiny immaculate detail in it that, you would have a hard time believing that started out as an oval with 2 circles.
And you work all of that detail out in the painting.
In the painting,
itself.
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And I use some kind of crazy reference too when I'm doing that. Like I talk about, ripping off other artists and, putting that through my filter. But I also rip off just like natural textures all the time. Like a thing that you wouldn't associate with an organic creature. Like I'll see a texture and be like, oh wow, like that's a really cool texture. And I'll incorporate that into like a seemingly organic figure, like rust and cracked and, pitted concrete. Like those are some of my favorite things. The texture of knotty trees, like a lot of times that stuff will inspire a whole painting. Like I'll just see a texture and be like, wow, like I'm going to, create something around that texture.
It's interesting. I mean, because I noticed your pieces do have some incredibly rich textures. It's interesting that sometimes is the launching pad for the piece.
Yeah, surprisingly. But more often than not, it's just the reference for whatever the image is going to be anyway. Like if it's going to be, a figure, like I'll take that texture and, morph the fleshy textures in with, the broken pitted concrete textures. So it creates this new thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect, from an organic living, breathing creature.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned you have a new show coming up. Your last show just closed a few weeks ago, Non-Entity at CoPro, but you said you have something coming up in November. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This also kind of goes back to the thing I was saying earlier about, living painting to painting, and if I don't paint, I don't eat. Like I always have a show coming up because I have to. Like, this is my job. Like, this is what I do for a living. This is how I earn money. So I have to have another show coming up. So the next featured show is going to be at Revolution Gallery in upstate New York in November. I would love to be able to lay out my detailed plan for the show, but it is still evolving as we speak. I've got a few ideas that I've been trying to work out, but like there's not a definitive theme that's presented itself yet. And there may not be, I don't know, like they may be completely unrelated paintings. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see how that whole thing works itself out.
Not to put pressure on you, but November's a couple months away, right?
I do know. I know painfully well how soon that is. And I think maybe some other, hardworking artists can probably relate with me on this when I say you get a show offer in, the beginning of the year, or, like in the summer, like, let's say, for example, you get an offer for a show in October or November. You get the offer in June. You're like, oh, well, that's many, many months from now. I have all the time in the world. I can, get all these other paintings finished that I need to finish and work on these commissions that I have out. And I'll have all kinds of time to work on this show. And then before you know it, you have 2 months left and you're like, oh man, that's right. October was really not that far away. So the best way to work on those shows is as soon as you get the offer, like, try and at least get some ideas written down for what you might like that show to look like. And then, if you're wise and efficient, try to pick away on that show from as early on as you're able. I also am going to be a part of the Arch Enemy Gallery, I guess, exhibit at Aqua, Miami. I believe that's in December. I'm just going to have one painting in that, very big group show, but I'm happy to be a part of that one too. But sorry, Arch Enemy, I also have not started on that one yet, but it's in my head. I've got the panel. There's some paint on it.
Nice.
It's happening. It's all happening because it has to happen.
Yeah. Do you know how, roughly how many pieces you're wanting to have for the Revolution Gallery show?
Yeah,
even if you don't necessarily have
that.
all the. Okay.
Yeah, like I know at least I want to have 5 paintings for sure. If I can make more quality paintings in the time that I've got left, that would be great. But I definitely want to have at least 5.
Do you think you'll be going? I mean, that's the other coast. You think you'll be going out for the opening?
No, it's not likely. It's pretty rare that I am able to go travel for the openings. The biggest barrier to that is often just the expense versus the potential income. Like it's so expensive to travel that like it often doesn't seem, I don't want to say worth it, because there are all kinds of benefits to being at the openings. Like the travel itself is one of the biggest benefits, and getting to meet like the gallerists that you might not get to meet otherwise. But just the financial cost versus profit, like maths. I hate you, but you kind of rule capitalist society. So yeah, I have to think about like what it's going to cost to travel to a show versus what I'm going to make from the show. And often it's just not reasonable to be able to travel for them. I would love to. I would love to be able to go to every single show all over the world, but I don't have it like that financially, unfortunately.
When is the opening? What day in November?
The show at Revolution opens on November 22nd.
Okay. So it's exactly 2 months. Today's September 22nd. So there you go.
There it is.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you online so they can keep up to date with these new shows you got coming up?
Okay, so I am one of these dinosaurs who's probably going to be left in the tar pits of Instagram. But that's the platform that I kind of came up with. And when I say came up with, I don't mean I created Instagram. I mean, like I grew with the platform and tried my best to figure that one out and kind of put all my eggs in that basket. So Instagram is my main source of connection with the outside world. And my Instagram account is at Lord Ego 1. So LORDEGO and the number 1. I also have a web shop, which is lordego1.com. Aside from that, there are all kinds of places where I have work floating silently and lifelessly in cyberspace for years. So if you did a Google search for my work, Ego Artwork or Lord Ego 1, I'm sure you would find all kinds of old stuff that's just floating dormant in cyberspace. But Instagram is the main one.
I noticed you were on DeviantArt for a while. That was the old stomping. I was there in the early 2000s, which it looks like your account started in 2006. So that was also around the time that I was probably lurking.
Oh, nice.
Also in kind of the dark arts area of that site. So people like Darius Sawatsky, guys like that were in the early DeviantArt.
Yeah, he did all right, didn't he?
Yeah.
That's still active. DeviantArt is still active. I don't post stuff on there often, but that account still exists. I haven't deleted it. I'm also on Kara, which is kind of a newer social media for artists. It felt like there was going to be some kind of an exodus from Instagram to Kara for a lot of artists. And I think a lot of folks did start accounts over there, but it doesn't look like it was quite the complete exodus that I think a lot of people thought it might be. I'm still definitely relying pretty heavily on Instagram, but I have got an account at Kara. I think most of the stuff that I do online is going to be under Lord Ego 1. So that's probably the best way to search for my work.
Very cool. So last question, and this is something that I like to ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
Knew this was coming. Oh, man. There's always going to be artists that I know that are going to feel left out when I do this.
But you can blame it on me. I just asked you for one. So, that's my fault, not yours.
Yeah. They're going to be like, why didn't you think of my name? I did think of your name. I'm sorry. I had to pick one. I'm going to pick another kind of up-and-coming artist who has kind of a similar background, in that he's currently a tattooer, but also trying to make his way in the world of fine art, and that's Brett Herman.
Very cool. Well, Ego, thank you so much for coming out and chatting with me today. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It is an actual pleasure. I'm not just saying that to be correct. Yeah, it was so much nicer than I expected it to be. Thanks.
Awesome. I'm glad. Were you expecting it to be a terrible experience?
Yeah, I was thinking this was going to be the worst day of my life, and you made it so that it wasn't. And I appreciate that. Thank you so much for not making this the worst day of my life.
Yeah, if I hope for anything, it's that I don't make people's day the worst day of their life.
Mission accomplished.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ego. It was interesting to hear him talk about the constant struggle and grind of the modern-day gallery artist, how he and a lot of his artist friends are living painting to painting, which can be a very tenuous place to be. It kind of reminds me of the chat with Travis last episode and how important it was to him to have a day job so that his art wasn't completely responsible for funding his life, because it can be a struggle otherwise, and that can be really limiting to creativity. If you're in the Buffalo area at the end of November, be sure to check out Ego's next solo show at Revolution Gallery. Opening on the 22nd, the show will consist of at least 5 new works. He's still working out the overall theme, but whatever it is, it'll no doubt be interesting. Be sure to follow his Instagram to keep up with the latest. So thanks again to Ego for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm truly grateful for your support. And just a reminder, one big way you could help out if you're really enjoying the show would be to check out the show's Patreon. You can find all the details on patreon.com/artaffairs. And as always, you can contact me through my website at artaffairs.podcast.com or on Instagram at artaffairs.podcast. So until next time, be good to yourself and be good to each other.
Mission accomplished.